Hi, Nate.
Hey, Tom. Today we're switching it up. I'm going to tell you my hypothetical life story and see what you think. I am a 15-year-old German. Germany is not enough of a meritocracy for me. I leave to the United States. I go to Columbia. At 19, I graduate first in my class as valedictorian. I go to work for the Future Fund, which is SBF's investment firm, for 1 year. I get my initial investments out the door. SBF happens. FTX goes poof. I decide to work at OpenAI. I get really fed up with their security practices. I go around the executives and go straight to the board. I end up getting fired for leaking. Now I am starting an investment fund focused on the AGI that is coming in the next 4 to 6 years and is going to make incredible returns. How do you think my decisions have gone?
Seems a little bit south of Q learning to me. But yeah, I also was in some of the same parts of that environment at a different stage of my career. So I offer this person my sympathies.
Yeah. I think it's like this is about Leopold Aschenbrenner, who posed some views that are contra to ours. I think he's obviously extremely smart and ambitious, which I respect. I've actually met him briefly in person. He recently released this situational awareness thing, which is a long document about the coming years in AI. I actually want to read it in full. It seems he's very well read. He did this 4-hour podcast with Dwarkesh where they do have reasons for their opinions. It's not like totally farcical. But I do think that the way that it is presented is just not really that helpful to where society is going and stuff like this. So welcome to the Retort. This is, I think, actually going to be a fun episode. We have a few weeks of backlog, which has given us this situational awareness memo by Leopold. It's dedicated to Ilya, RIP, the super alignment team. That may have been a recent thing. And we have the Apple news, which I think these two narratives together are really different for AI, which I really appreciate. I think I wrote a long blog post about Apple, which was a little rushed because if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that I'm holding up my microphone that's supposed to be on a fancy arm because I recently moved and I don't have any of my stuff. And we're just doing this bootleg style. But the Apple stuff I think is really good for people that care about like realistic discourse on AI and just kind of comparing what Apple has talked about and how they present things to the super alignment implosion. The situational awareness document is just very rich. So I think that's what we're going to do today. Tom is also at an event that is going to an event or attending remotely this event that is going to provide more interesting context to this. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but I think it's good timing as well.
Yeah, I'll be swimming upstream like a salmon spawning every season to Asilomar, California for the annual AI safety workshop hosted by the Center for Human Compatible AI. I assume that it's still the case that chain of house rules apply, so I have to be a little bit sensitive to that, but I'm happy to announce that, yes, I will be there, as I have been every year it's gone on.
Yeah. Are you a co-author with Stuart? I'm recently a co-author with Stuart Russell on an accepted peer-reviewed paper, so I'm feeling legit. I'm a legit AI person now.
Yeah, that is a feather in the cap, I guess. I don't know that Stuart and I have co-authored some. Well, okay. We technically co-designed a graduate seminar syllabus that we designed together. This was a class called, I believe it was called Foundations for Beneficial AI, which I co-taught with Stuart along with 3 other professors. Some of whom I think are also actually co-authors on that paper. Wes Holliday was one of them. Social choice folks. And we taught that together in spring 2020. What a time to be alive.
Yeah, seriously.
That class. Yeah, so that's the closest I've gotten, I think, to that particular marker of status in the AI world with Professor Russell.
Yeah. Do you think we should go?
But he's a friend.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that paper is interesting. My eyes were totally open to, like, I didn't know what social choice theory was. And that group is really, it's good to have those voices kind of amplifying things. But
I will be organizing a plenary panel at the workshop on deployment safeguards, and it will touch on the value and also the limitations of social choice with respect to deployment safeguards.
That makes sense. How about we go chronologically? Let's talk about situational awareness and kind of riff on how ridiculous this thing is.
When did it drop? Yeah, so
Last
chronologically
week
means
sometime.
what? Last week?
Yeah, it dropped when this Dwarkash interview came out, which was like normally Tuesdays, I think. I ended up I listened to the first hour and then I hopped on Twitter because I'm so frustrated. I looked this wrong rant tweet about how I think that extrapolating orders of magnitude is just kind of ridiculous. Because it's like essentially all of scaling laws is built on this idea that as you have this like log plot where you have a log axis of compute and a log axis of like test loss, that it's a straight line. So you 10x the compute, you get some log linear improvement, and it's just like okay, so there are reasonable arguments that this has lasted for like 15 to 20 orders of magnitude, so it should probably continue, but I just think the lapse in the argument is that increasing like a leveling off improvement in test loss in linear space is just like it's not an exponential. It's not an exponential improvement in the test loss, and they just claim these things like GPT-2 elementary school person, GPT-3 middle schooler, GPT-4 high schooler, and then like they're like 4 years down the line it's going to be an AI researcher by just extrapolating this line. So it's like, yeah, I can have fun with plots too. I can tell ChatGPT to turn that same plot into a fucking pie graph, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't mean anything. So it's just, I think they get out over their skis on the technical reality where deep learning is still going. But we don't have any. It's like what Francois Chalais was saying on Jorkas's most recent podcast, where they're talking about how LLMs aren't actually intelligent, but it's just pattern matching, and it's like drawing information. But it's just like I think it's somewhere in the middle, and then there's the communication of it is just not good.
I feel like they're also I qualify this, I guess, as somebody who has not read the full manifesto. I skimmed the introduction before we started recording this. I was aware of it, and I have had, frankly, other more pressing uses of my time, such that I've not taken a complete deep dive on this. But my sense is that they're also out over their skis on the social reality here. And to some extent, I've, been speaking to this before on our show, but my stance on this increasingly is when you look at the state of things and the exponentials in capital investment that have taken off since 2022, certainly, a lot of this is a combination of just the enormous amount of data that is available online that can be used as a grist for the mill, on one hand. That's one. And then two, the fact that there are these very long-standing narratives about AI and sentience or, superintelligence or whatever you want to call it, that have existed since, the 1940s and 50s. Those are two very different contexts, right? There's this kind of collective fantasy of robots that are as or more intelligent than humans. And then on the other, there's this just material reality.
There's a really, you might want to control F in this document, but he uses the word unhobbling, which is where like, if you get GPT-4 to work in a feedback loop, you're going to get a step function improvement, which is like, they do try to bring in these RL analogies, but I just don't think they're doing it in the way that is technically correct. Like, I don't think, I just don't think
I'm perversely interested in that. So I maybe should I'm curious to take a closer look at it. But again, just from reading the introduction and from what others have told me about the spirit of this document, I do not believe that people in San Francisco or the Bay Area are smarter than other people.
Yeah.
I don't.
I agree.
I also frankly know that. And I say that as somebody who was themselves somebody who lived in the Bay Area for, the duration of grad school. And I was not smarter than other people. I was more proximate to developments, technical developments, and that was interesting. And I did learn a lot from that. But I was in a position to learn those things. There wasn't any kind of native like superiority that I had as a result of that. And I certainly situational awareness is an odd way even to describe that advantage.
A lot of it is about national security. So I think the name is mostly about national security.
Well, that's what I'm sensing, right? Is that it's a militaristic kind of metaphor, and that doesn't make sense to me in the context of that. It very much remains in my mind what these exponentials amount to.
Oh yeah, I
are overwhelmingly market forces, not anything related.
And this is like why we could segue into or we could pull in the second core thing to talk about is like the Apple stuff. And I find it so funny that he's releasing this manifesto about national security concerns, and he's also running an investment firm about AGI. But any investment firm that is predicated on the AGI really should be trying to understand what are the new companies that are going to be able to do Apple-like things. Because I think Apple is only entrenching itself with all of its AI efforts, and it's making the model providers have to go through Apple to make their buck. So it's like at one time he's off in national security land, but I think the right investment thing to do is to find the startups that are going to be able to do what Apple is doing. And they just seem like the two narratives are totally at odds with each other.
Apple seems to be able to do that in part because Apple has a very distinct narrative. It's a well-established company. It's actually still saying this, but certainly compared to the world that this manifesto is coming out of, it's a very old company, right? I mean, this is a company that's from the late 70s, early 80s is sort of what it's coming out of, and it's certainly a visionary company, famously, from its founding, and arguably remains that way. We've discussed that before, actually, on this show, whether that's still true. But I think it's at least true to the extent that Apple can afford financially and also in terms of PR to basically articulate a different brand for what AI's integration into consumer products can or should look like.
Yeah. Did you see the title, AI for the Rest of Us? Or that wasn't the title, but they had that in one of their last few slides. And I thought that was such an Apple-y thing to say.
It does strike me as clever because, again, I in our previous conversation about Apple, I forget how many episodes back that was, I sort of pointed back to the famous ad that they did during the Super Bowl in 1984 of the kind of marathon runner throwing a sledgehammer at Big Brother, which it's that the genius of it, right, is that Apple is a tech company, but its brand has always been that we're kind of a tech company for the rest of the people, like the real people, the rest of the world. We're not totalitarians. We're not trying to centralize. We're not interested in winning the war of situational awareness, right? That's not what we're doing. We're trying to make it so that the products that are being built are easy to use, out of the box, trustworthy, designed with you in mind, and that will always be true end to end. And they're just now bringing those values to the world of generative AI, which we can quibble over whether or not that's right, or possible, or meaningful, even intelligible, but it fits their brand, which is to say their story. And that story is, it seems, antithetical to the story that's coming out of these manifestos that we've been discussing, right? Because even the new situational awareness stuff, this kind of reminds me of the Horowitz document, right? The kind of futurist manifesto.
Yeah, the techno-optimist. It's a different angle on it.
Well, it sounds more dystopian and, again, more militaristic, but very much still fetishizing the exponentials.
Yeah. My new favorite thing, I mean, like, they are. I think I'm having a hard time trying to draw them being similar. I felt like the techno-optimism manifesto was much more like get out of our way, whereas situational awareness is like, hey, look at me, we need to be more serious. Which is so odd to say that we need to be like, look at me, we need. I think like situational awareness is calling for government intervention. Well, techno-optimist manifesto is like, we are the people, you should all get out of our way. but they do both assume that AI is the thing, and its pace is only going to continue.
They both strike me as a bit self-important and a bit myopic with respect to the rest of the world. I'm sorry to say.
I
Like,
agree.
I mean, just paint this, just like, look, San Francisco, situational awareness. There's first of all just the brute reality that what is being built there, this is a classic case of commodity fetishism, right? I just was looking at statistics on this yesterday. Like, data centers are also growing exponentially, and they're not in San Francisco. Okay, they're in
arguably more important.
Kansas, Nebraska, Virginia, apparently, where I now live. There's like a huge push for this. Like, just other parts of the United States. I'm not even talking about the rest of the world, where it's going to be even more of like an infrastructural commitment. Like, there's whole paths to national economic development that may well now be paved in part by silicon, like through this kind of application. And that's also like, there's the whole semiconductor discourse of this. There's the whole, do people in Taiwan have more or less situational awareness than people in San Francisco?
Honestly, they probably have a lot more.
I mean, I would say that, yeah, there's a compelling case that I would learn more about and be more situationally aware about the geopolitics, studio quotes for those who are just listening. I would get more of that probably about the geopolitics of AI if I interviewed the top semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan, right, about their plans, rather than just if I talked to, OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepMind folks based in the Bay Area. I already know what those folks will say. A lot of what they say is rooted in projections. In Taiwan, I think what they would say would be rooted in the fact that they actually build stuff. And so they could directly speak to how much of what they know will exist or not on a 6 to 12, 24 month time span, during which or after which China may or may not invade, and that they may or may not have contingency plans about this stuff. That seems to me, if situational awareness is the metaphor that we want to use here, look to Taiwan, look to Saudi Arabia, look to Sub-Saharan Africa, look to Virginia. I wouldn't look to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, like local politics of the U.S. and the geopolitics are probably far more important to the future of humanity right now than whatever 10x builder bigger data centers we're going to predict every year. I also just get such a kick out of them all. They refer to orders of magnitude as ooms, which for plebes in academia and people that aren't rich means out of memory error. So they've just repurposed this old term.
Oh, that's genuinely bizarre.
It's so funny.
That's bizarre.
Oh, this is so. They talk about ooms. They love some. What is it? A TLA, a 3-letter acronym. Just getting a kick out of them talk. I was like,
they made an acronym out of an acronym. Okay.
Yeah.
This is something else. Let me first of all, I guess there's two things that come to mind in response to that. One is the people in the Bay Area building this stuff, they're not the next Oppenheimer. I'm sorry, they're just not. And I've said this before, and it remains to be true, that Oppenheimer was a physicist, and the people who work in Silicon Valley are engineers. There is a difference, several differences between being an engineer and being a scientist. I know we use words like computer science to describe the disciplines through which, so these people are trained and move and think. But if you're just treating data as a scalar resource, you're not a scientist. That's not how experiments work. I remember, I forget if I've told this story before. I mean, in my earliest graduate classes in CS at Berkeley, the only, I was frankly behind these classes, in many, so I told aspects of that story I think previously, but the weeks of those classes when I definitely felt I had something to contribute and was consistently the alone raising my hand was when Anko would ask us can anybody explain the difference between a dependent and independent variable?
Yeah, they're I don't know.
There were just crickets because of course, and again, I'm not saying they're stupid. It's just if
I can
your
visualize
MO,
that so well from Anka. I feel like
yeah,
Anka's like on top of her shit in kind of a wacky way. And she would just
if your
eviscerate
MO
people.
is just to publish half a dozen NeurIPS papers every year and beat benchmarks, then why would you ever need to learn about the difference between those two things? That's not your prerogative. But if your goal is to be a scientist and have some kind of conceptual basis and understanding of why a certain result is meaningful with respect to some kind of at least partially controlled experimental apparatus, that's a pretty important distinction to understand. And this is something that seems to be, even now, remarkably absent from the discourse.
I mean,
And in
I
fact,
deal with this in my day-to-day life. Like the goals of
yeah,
different subcultures, even at the Allen Institute, there are very different subcultures among people and what they are interested in and how they want to market what they are doing. And even among people that are obviously like generally aligned on so many things, there's just kind of the moments where I'm just all like, I just said something and you just responded to something totally different, and I'm just gonna kind of like, what?
it remains a strange moment, and I don't want to sound like a poo-pooer or a naysayer. I mean, I guess in some ways I'm kind of introducing a negative or a qualifying energy to these conversations, but I still engage in this stuff. I still think it's very interesting, and I do still think that down the road, what seems to be happening, we're in the early stages of it still, I think, is that AI is finally kind of prying itself away from the matrix of like cognitive science that it's been stuck in, for many, many decades now, since the 60s or 70s. There's this famous diagram, right, of like cog sci and what fields comprise that. And it's things like linguistics, psychology, neuroscience. And then AI is like just one of the branches of that.
Yeah, this is something that someone in my Discord for the interconnects asked me to write about. It's like, what is intelligence? And I have a lot of like unprocessed thoughts on this, but it's like, are language models still going to be considered AI in 10 years when there's something else down the line? And like, what is intelligence, and whether or not you can match human intelligence with a language model or a neural network? I generally am very like, I don't think human intelligence is special. I think it's statistically extremely rare, and there's a large amount of computation in the form of evolution that has gotten us to this point. And that computation is really hard to map onto what people are doing now. So the likelihood that we create a neural network that is anywhere remotely close to the human brain is so low, but I'm totally happy calling both of what we like, the human brain and the large language model, some sort of powerful general intelligence. And I do think that like what language models are doing is a form of intelligence. I think it's very different than what humans are doing, but I do think there's plenty of value in it. And I like compare, like, plants have forms of intelligence where like they turn to the sun and they're processing information in the form of light to change how they act. And I just think it's like the fixation on what human intelligence is just fixating on something very narrow in the scope of what is surely out there in the universe. Like,
I agree. And yeah, this is sort of what I mean, that when or if the mechanisms that truly do underpin what LLMs already do, let alone what they might soon or in the future be able to do, when or if we do begin to seriously uncover and discover those things at scale, I highly doubt that it's going to be richly comparable to the mechanisms that underpin human intelligence. And I'm fine with that. In fact, I think that's more interesting and more exciting. And this leads to the second point I wanted to make. The first point was a lot of these folks are kind of, myopic physics envy type folks who I think should, maybe just take a chill pill and accept the fact that science is hard and mechanistic understanding takes time, and that you can't exponentially your way out of mechanistic understanding. That's the first point. The second point that we're now getting into is, I think there's a growing disrespect for language and just the richness of semantics that I see percolating, like in some of these writings.
yeah,
The fact that there's this kind of cute, ironic willingness to make acronyms out of acronyms or play across acronyms. Like, language is breaking down in some of these documents in ways that you're kind of supposed to find funny. I don't know if it's any one thing causing this. It's probably a combination of social media, Twitter,
Language models themselves.
General institutional failure. Yeah, and language models themselves. Yes, the fact that, like, I think it's interesting. I even was just skimming it. Like, he's understandably, I could have predicted that, critical of the people who say language models are they're just stochastic. They're just predicting the next token. And then, of course, he's like, "Oh, that's not an interesting statement or a meaningful statement." But it's almost like the voice of it is not so much that he thinks that they're doing anything else as that he doesn't care, and that's enough. Like, why can't I just bootstrap my way to tokenizing all meaning? And I think there is an important reason you can't do that. It's not a computational reason, though. It's at the level of just what would it mean for you to do that. And there's a profound lack of imagination about when you just decompose language into something that can be predicted in terms of tokens, and you just lose any patience or curiosity about any other way to approach language. That cheapens you. That makes you poorer intellectually. And I think it short circuits your ability to become something like a scientist about these language models, because you lose the ability to think of them as anything other than tokenizers.
I think there are people in these labs that appreciate the richness of language. I think fine-tuning, particularly like people that are trying to take the art, like the model, and shape it into a form that is useful for users. In order to do that well, you need to understand that information is more than, like, language is more than just like the raw bits on the page, and that there are kind of intangibles to it. I think Amanda Askell talks about this at Anthropic, which is like really, really trying to understand what it means for these models to have different personalities. And that's where she draws on a lot of her experience as a philosopher. I actually want to talk to her about this. It's like, what do these things actually mean? Like, she talks about this and then she doesn't go too deep into it. And like, what are the things that she worries about in terms of alignment techniques that we are using, and philosophically what the powerful technology should be able to represent and what they should not be able to, and kind of like what she is seeing. I think I've heard multiple times through Anthropic media that she's like the person that talks to language models the most, and I do think that is important. And I talk to language models more than most people at AI too, because I'm the annoying person that's like, we're training these, we need to talk to them, benchmarks are important, but that's the only thing. And I bet she talks to them maybe 10 or 100 times as much as I do. And I think there's something that we're not going to be able to really tap into without understanding that, because what she has access to is different models at different stages of this kind of pipeline, safe, unsafe, intentionally unsafe, like amplified unsafe, like different personalities. And I think that's where we should be going, is like, what is the range of capacity that these models can actually represent outside of what they're like served as. So like what GPT is served as a default is important for what it is doing in its language, but also, like we were talking about science, it's important to know like what the fundamental limits of these things are and communicate that. And we've talked about other things like the model spec, which will inform us how they're determining the language and stuff like this, but there's we need access to this layer beneath that, which is like, what are the many things we can even try.
It sounds like what she's doing is kind of like phenomenology of investigation of like these models. So that's just a kind of fancy term to describe a tradition that was started by this dude Edmund Husserl in the, I guess, if I recall correctly, early 20th century German philosophical context. And he had famous students like Heidegger, who you may have heard of. Heidegger wrote some famous essays on technology that maybe are at the, second or third degree away from people in AI now these days. But yeah, Husserl's point was that philosophy had not yet become very good at scientifically investigating experience. So his point was sort of like, if you look at people like Descartes or Hume or Kant or Locke, the really famous folks, the empiricists on the one hand, the rationalists on the other, who were trying to come up with an understanding of how it is that we process reality, they tended to focus a lot on stories, interpretations of the soul or of what it meant to be human, rather than actually doing something like a systematic, comparative, empirical investigation of when I wake up every day and drink coffee, what does that feel like? What is my experience of it? It's a Husserl sort of basically called this project phenomenology, which is the study of the lived experience of things. And he did it through things like coffee. Often it was very mundane things, but he really unlocked in his writings this profoundly different and very generative and creative tradition of philosophical interpretation. And the reason I was thinking of it as well, there's a book that maybe your listeners would be interested in perusing by Gadamer, another one of his students, or rather one of Heidegger's students, called Truth and Method, where he actually has a whole section of it. It's on language. It's on what it means for language to be interpretive or to interpret language. And his point is that in the Western tradition, there are two basically very different ways of thinking about what language does. One is that it represents reality in this kind of picturesque way. And it's composed of...
Do you mean represent or measure? I think language is a measurement in time. So like without the time of when language was taken, I think it like if you take the same sentence, it means different things in time. So I think it's hard to like say it is a full representation.
Well, that may bear on the second of the positions
Okay.
I was going to outline. So the first position is just this idea that language is sort of like a painting or a photograph or something like that, that's meant to distill whatever reality seems to be, and it does that through strings or letters or words. And that the meaning...
Or tokens, integers.
Or tokens, that's right. and the idea is, and he credits Leibniz with this idea. He sort of takes the picture back to that guy, historically, who argued that meaning is just some arbitrary function of how many strings or tokens or letters or words it takes to make computable, you could say, some meaning, some signifier. And so that could be a lot, that could be a few, that could be some structure, but that's all language is. That's all it can be, and that's all it needs to be. The other perspective, which Gadamer credits actually to the Bible and the tradition of biblical hermeneutics, which is to say, like, how different people have interpreted the Bible in the Christian tradition, let's say, is that language is revelatory. Language does not represent reality, it evokes it. And it distills it in ways that reveal things about reality that you otherwise could not do. So it's a tool, but it's a tool that intervenes on how we experience things, that makes it then possible to go about investigating reality differently.
Yeah, I like this. I'd like to take an AI analogy and see how you feel about this with respect to what you've just said, to kind of let you keep cooking. What is popular with language models is this auto-regressive prediction, where they predict one token at a time. A lot of people, especially in this situationally aware group in San Francisco, are saying that each token is like computation that is needed to let the model think. I think that mirrors how we write, but does not mirror necessarily how we actually think about things. There are other ways to generate text, such as with the diffusion model. This is not as popular because it doesn't work as well, but you could use a diffusion model which will generate the entire sequence at once. I believe that is technically possible, where it's like the entire sequence of text is generated at once and it's kind of denoised to be coherent. And I think that's probably more of what goes on in our brain, where we kind of arrive at the thought, but in the act of writing it, forces our thought into like a specific form, which is closer to what language models are doing. But I think this language models don't suitably acknowledge the like depth of writing that can come from, like, when you are writing well and seriously, like, it really just feels like the ideas come in coherent chunks, and then you're like, well, might as well write that down. It's not like you write half of a sentence and you're like, oh, what will come next? Like that's really not how it works. And I think that leans into what language is doing in capturing reality and things, and it's a wonderful process when it's going well. Like, writing really does help your thinking from this kind of interface.
What you said reminds me of another much more recent essay by Cormac McCarthy, the American novelist, who wrote things like The Road, Obliterate, and No Country for Old Men. He wrote the book that the movie is based on. But some people don't know this. McCarthy lived for, I think, the last several decades of his life. He was based at the Santa Fe Institute he got very interested in complex systems, complexity theory, and apparently became very close friends with people like the Murray Gell-Mann, who came up with at least the term of the quark, and like was a famous like particle physicist in many different ways, sort of a polymath in other ways too, and just lots of other personalities of folks who were there. And McCarthy wrote an essay, I think came out 2018, something like that, called the Kekulé problem. We can put a link to this in the show notes. And the essay is really about language. And it's about why we bothered to evolve, why it is that humans evolved a capacity for language. That's a very speculative question, but if you're going to be an authority on it, it's probably a good place to be at Santa Fe Institute, because you're surrounded by folks who study evolutionary linguistics and stuff like that. As I recall, the thesis of that essay was McCarthy's supposition that we have what makes humans distinctive, and like what makes our behavior operate the way that it does overwhelmingly, is that we have something called an unconscious, which he, I think, refers to as a machine that operates an animal. So the unconscious is just, and we've kind of discussed this before on the show, that like the unconscious is just, it's all the information, it's all of the energy, it's all of the emotion, it's all the, you could even say situational awareness, that you somehow incorporate, but you literally incorporate it. It no longer is something conscious. It's not something that you actively think about, it's just there. You just carry it with you. And it's a basis for your intelligence, but it's really just more, in a more basic sense, it's a basis for you're just being an animal. And what he then does is compare that to why it is that typically when we dream, and often when you look at cases where scientists have had dreams that were important prior to some eureka moment or discovery that they made, it's often the case that they would have dreams that are non-linguistic in nature. They're symbolic, but not even in a like linguistic way. In this more sort of holistic Gestalt-based way. There's a famous anecdote, this is what's called the Kekulé problem. The scientist who discovered the molecular structure of benzene is that it's a hexagon, I believe of, if I'm not going to butcher this, I think it's some carbon-hydrogen kind of combination is what's going on there. But the way in which the molecule is structured is as a hexagon between those different atoms. Anyway, he had a dream, supposedly, the night before he had this breakthrough, of the Ouroboros, which is a snake eating its own tail, which is like a very famous alchemical symbol. And he had been puzzling for weeks or months about how to understand benzene, how to make sense of its physical properties, its chemical, things he could do in the laboratory. He has this dream, and then supposedly that's the breakthrough of like, oh, it's something like a circle, or it's a hexagon, or it's a different kind of geometry. So what McCarthy's doing in an essay is trying to say how what language may be is a response on the part of our conscious minds to the energies that are stored in the unconscious, but that are not themselves linguistic in nature. So language is sort of like a cognitive tool for trying to distill and make sense of these vast repositories of meaning and information and significance that are encoded in the unconscious, but not in a linguistic way. And so what you said reminded me of this essay, because that, if that's true, that would imply something like language isn't computational in nature. It's not about assembling strings together in ways that add up to meaning. It's about distillation in a more holistic way, in a more psychologically Gestalt-like way, in a more the whole being more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, where I think this is going is that where most reasonable people agree is that there are plenty of things that AI is not going to replace in what humans do. But in the things that are matched to kind of this brute force methodology, AI is just going to do better at. But there's a long tail of things that, and I think the most fulfilling things that the AI is just going to not going to be remotely close to doing. And I think a lot of them would surprise people. I think that like good writing, I don't know if AI is going to be able to do it. I can't, like the class, like a classic. Like I don't know, like that level of breakthrough meaning, I don't think they're going to be able to do. I think it draws on this, And then,
Concretely, right.
Yeah.
This would be an implication. Is that I think McCarthy was interested in writing that essay because he's one of my favorite writers, right, for the record, and he's been famous for writing several different books that are seen as like winning all the awards and being these kinds of creative breakthroughs. And I think that kind of, and I hesitate to use the word, but that kind of frontier creativity is something that you would be hard pressed to see from a language model, because it requires, ultimately, I think, being at a certain place in history with respect to human culture and energy and psychology all at once. And I'm not saying it's impossible for an AI someday to do something like that, but I don't think anything coming out of Silicon Valley these days, even if you scale it, is going to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, and why it makes me sad is that I think it'll be increasingly hard to find these things. I don't think the look or appearance or basic sound of these things when you take snippets of them looks very different than what comes out of AI, but this like completeness or other subtle things are what's judging it. So then the art might be lost by raising the ceiling, or like raising the noise floor, so to say. And like the true value is going to be lost within this, and I don't know how to maintain that.
I mean, to be fair, it was never easy to write a masterpiece. Right. There's always some informal power law distribution of the number of humans there are at a given moment.
Yeah, I'm not saying about writing them. I'm saying about finding them.
Right. Yes, that is a distinct dimension of this.
Like if there are 1,000 more books, it's probably going to be much harder to find a true masterpiece, because they're not going to always come from the authors who have already written. Eventually, in 100 years, all the authors who have pre-vetted, pre-AI are no longer going to be, like, they're not going to have the reputation to draw them on. And are they going to be surfaced by AI? I suspect that there's going to be a lot of automation in the stack by which content is surfaced. That type of magic is probably going to be harder.
I think this is ultimately, it's more a distinction that's existential than a distinction that's cognitive. Humans precede AI. Our relationship with creation, with the world, with our own species, is ours. It's not something that, at least none of the AI that's now being built, can share in that relationship unless we delegate to it, and that then becomes the stakes. If we delegate that task to AI, then that will, I think, make us a significantly different species. Frankly,
and I think Apple is not interested in delegating that. I think going back on topic, and they showed no interest in doing that.
No, and it's interesting. In Apple's case, their story seems to me, to be the same one that they've been telling for about 45 years.
Do you think their narrative is the most like philosophically aligned with human, it just get like with maintaining a sort of human nature and culture?
Well, I think there's a continuity there that maybe just comes from the fact that Apple's an older company, and so they were never historically an AI company, to my knowledge anyway. AI was sort of developing, I guess, in other parts of Silicon Valley parallel to it. It was always a technology company that was trying to make technology as easy to use as riding a bike, right? Famously. These are tools. They're meant to be tools that ergonomically fit very well into human life. My stance on this is, and I, to be fair, I'm not an Apple fanboy, but I am recording this off of an iMac. And
I'm planning on upgrading to try the new AI features. I mean, well, I'm like an AI influencer, so it's like it is now part of my job.
I think what's missing, Apple's vision remains consumerist. Fundamentally, it's always been consumerist. Nothing, and that makes sense, right? And it's fine. That's different than this situational awareness bullshit, but that's what it is. And I still believe that the stakes here that are not being spoken to, and that I suspect are what really end up mattering, are the political stakes. That it's really, how is it that what is being built is, in all but name, public infrastructure? Apple never thought of itself as building public infrastructure. DOJ is suing it because they're accusing Apple of being so good at gatekeeping with their products that there are political ramifications to the degree of market control that they have. Now, I'm not even weighing on that to say my point. My point is we don't yet seem to have a vision for thinking about AI as public infrastructure whose stakes are fundamentally or primarily political that could be a basis for achieving new or previously unachievable political ends. I still have not seen that in these manifestos. I see a lot of urgency.
Should we write a manifesto?
There's stuff that I'm not ready to quite speak about yet publicly that I have had cooking for some time.
Brought to you exclusively on the Retort. We'll only past the 40-minute mark where people are truly still listening.
Time will tell. I mean, yeah, there's clearly, and I say this again. I think it's important for me to clarify. I'm going to say this in the Chunk workshop as well. I can sort of out myself. I don't think Chat's rules prevent me from doing that. So I can sort of say
no, they just prevent information.
Okay. In my point of view, I think people in AI, and I understand this, I tend to see people shy away from the word political because there are these sort of cultural connotations of like when you call something political, that implies that it's like zero sum, like there are winners and losers, or that it's about power in some just like very cartoonish sense. That's really not the way I'm using the word political. I'm using the word political, I guess it includes some of those things, but it's really broader. It's really more about when you call something political, what you're saying is that the issue rests on the capacity of some agent to self-determine. The question being faced is, what kind of agent am I? What kind of environment, so to speak, am I operating within? And what is it worth doing in that environment? Those are political questions. And they're political because they're about the most basic features of what it means for an agent to self-determine. This is the way the ancient Greeks thought about politics. They didn't say things were political because Sparta was at war with Athens, or because we have to defeat Persia, or because we have to put down the rabble for the sake of the aristocracy. It included those sorts of issues, but it was really just about what is the polis? What is a city-state? The whole purpose of a polis was to self-determine, was for an organic form of life to be possible at the level of the polis. You gave the example of a plant that sort of learns to, position itself towards the sun for purpose of photosynthesis types of stuff. The Greeks thought about city-states quite similarly, not about like towards the sun, but the polis as sort of the basic political unit of life, human life. And their questions, and this is the way Aristotle wrote, and Plato, they disagreed. But that's basically what they agreed about. That was what the stakes were. And we don't talk about it that way. We don't talk about who we are that way, and we don't talk about AI that way, to our detriment.
Yeah, I think some people do. It seems like it used to be more in vogue, and now it's kind of the incremental model, blah. This is the path we are on. I think that this is the path we are on is an argument that I have made, which is like not that compelling. It's just like, so what? Like, so what that this is the path that we are on? Like, what autonomy are we giving up by declaring that this language model thing is going to play out? Like I have said, like, this is the next 2 years. Like, the VC cycle will come and go, but this is the path that we need to go through. Like, that is a very loaded statement where we are kind of, like, I have a marginal ability to shift the direction, but so many people accepting that this is the path is kind of like a subliminal agreement where many powers that be have decided together that this is the way that we are going. And it is not predetermined. It is like co-determined.
I think that's well said. Yeah. And I agree with that. And I would just add that it is co-determined by what remain basically commercial interests.
Hey, I work at a nonprofit now. I don't make money.
Well,
I'm joking. You're right. I'm just joking.
I didn't mean that as a critique. I know.
Well,
not as a critique of you. It's a critique, I guess, of this discourse, because by commercial, what I mean is, capital investment. That's just what it takes.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about this. We had a whole episode where we were kind of talking about the theme that like compute is the most basic currency determining winners and losers in AI. I think this is why we have
still
government.
seems true.
This is still my one of my biggest fears of AI is if it is so powerful, the power will accrue to one company, and that company will potentially be bigger than the government. And if that is true, then capitalism actually will make decisions. If a company has a bigger budget than the government, that changes the way by which ships can be steered. I think.
We're already
it's
halfway there.
unproven. It's unproven.
We're already halfway there. Yeah. Well, it's unproven, but increasingly there's a reason people feel. Talk about the unconscious again. People feel that. People feel it when you're on Twitter. You feel it when you check the news. You feel it when you hear about the latest. It's not fully conscious, and we don't really talk about it very much. We don't really know how to, but this is the feeling. I suspect that looming possibility, I don't think people will buy it. I don't think it'll happen. And the reason is not because it's going to like fail for reasons of efficiency. I think people just don't want to live that way. How or when that'll break, I'm not sure. But I have a certain kind of confidence in human nature on this. People eventually will want to self-determine. And they already do. They just don't know how to. It's not clear what the gateway is yet. Apple's like a halfway house. Because they're like, we're going to build this for the rest of you. But we're still building for the rest of you. And we're not yet seeing, I think, the full free flag of the alternative.
Yep. Should we close our freak flag for the day?
I think so. We went deep on this one.
Yeah,
that was fun.
It was interesting. We'll track down in the show notes the book you mentioned, whatever. What is it, like Truth and
Method and the Kekulé essay.
We'll track those down. Thanks for listening. Have a good one. You can email us at mail@retortai.com. I'll check that at some point.
Bye, everybody.
Bye for now.